Hello there. You join me today as I continue my look at the wines from the Jacobs Creek range. Today I'm tasting their Double Barrel Shiraz, and this is the 2020 vintage of that. Now, Jacobs Creek has been a very important brand in the development of the Australian wine industry. It's a brand that really built its reputation on producing great value for money wines. And the Jacobs Creek range, developing from 1976 onwards, initially really was what they now call the classic range. And today the brand produces somewhere in the region, I believe, of 6 million cases of wine a year. So that's something like 75 million bottles. This is all produced at their winery in Rowland Flat at the southeastern end of the Barossa Valley. And these wines are available in somewhere in the region of 70 countries worldwide. Given the brand's global positioning, part of their current emphasis is to try and premiumize their range, to move some of their range up the quality spectrum to a tier above that of good value everyday drinking. Now, originally, the wines from the Orlando winery would have been the premium range that complemented Jacobs Creek. But during the late 1980s and early 1990s, when Pernod Ricard owned Jacobs Creek, the Orlando name was dropped from the label and emphasis was very much focused on the Jacobs Creek brand. Now today the Jacobs Creek wine portfolio comprises somewhere in the region of 30 different varieties, blends or styles, grouped across somewhere in the region of 10 distinct commercial tiers. So the wines I've already looked at have been from the classic range, varietal wines and popular blends for everyday drinking. Above that, there's a reserve range, and these are wines that are a step up in quality and have a geographical focus. Another to the premium range, the Double Barrel, are a range of quite powerful wines that have been finished by aging them in casks that previously held spirits. As well as this, there's a range of sparkling wines. There's a range called Le Petit, wines with an Australian twist. There's the unvined range of de-alcoholized wines. And then there are a number of heritage and limited release wines that are premium, they're experimental, and are often wines made as small batches. Now, in my last few videos, I've been over the history of Jacobs Creek, so I'll just try and recap that briefly. The brand finds its origin in two of the pioneers of winemaking in the Barossa Valley, Johann Gramps, who settled in Rowland Flat in 1847, and William Jacob, who moved there in 1840. During the 1840s and 50s, both of those pioneers planted vineyards on the banks of Jacobs Creek. And in 1916, a few years after William Jacob's death, the two companies were combined when G. Gramps and Sons purchased the Jacob family's winery and vineyards. G. Gramps and Sons in Orlando have always been seen as innovative. During the 1950s and 60s, they did a lot to redefine production of sparkling wine and white wines in Australia. They were the first people to import equipment to enable them to make Charmat method or tank fermented sparkling wines, enabling them to make their highly popular value for money brand Barossa Pearl. Also, their introduction of cool fermentation allowed them to make beautiful aromatic wines such as the Steingarten Riesling. I guess Jacobs Creek itself was really quite innovative as a brand, being launched in 1976 at a stage when the company had been taken over by Reckitt and Coleman. Within 4 years, the brand was Australia's best-selling red wine. And by 1993, following some major export initiatives, the brand exported 2 million cases of wine. Now, in 1989, the French company Pernod Ricard purchased G. Gramps and Sons, and so the Orlando winery and the Jacobs Creek brand. And this was their first significant purchase in the Australasian market. Now, true to their innovative background, Jacobs Creek actually have a sensory lab, which they use in conjunction with quite extensive market research to help them refine their wine styles. And this is how the Double Barrel range came about, as an attempt to reach consumers looking for more generous styles of wine. Starting in 2012, they set about to create a product that would command a premium and serve this niche. Clearly, if you're looking for premiumization, the concept of double barrel aging makes that premiumization quite clear. It sets the wine quite clearly above the classic range in that it takes its oak influence from being aged in barrel rather than having staves put in fermentation. And I guess then the idea that it's received a double barrel treatment almost doubles the premiumization. It is quite common that spirits, such as whiskey, are finished in barrels that have previously held wines. Classically, malt whiskey has aged in sherry casks, but you will also find instances of malt whiskey producers aging wines in, say, sauterne casks, port casks, and even casks that had previously held red wine. Conveniently for this venture, of course, Pernod Ricard, as Jacobs Creek's then parent company, also own Chivas Brothers and a portfolio of whiskey brands such as Ballantine's, 100 Pipers, Royal Salute, and as well as that they run 14 malt whiskey distilleries in Scotland, as well as Jameson's distillery in Ireland. Now in April 2025, Pernod Ricard's wine arm was sold off and merged with Accolade Wines to create a large global wine company called Vinarchy, with brands coming from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and Chile. So it will be interesting to see if the arrangement continues and the double barrel brand survives Jacobs Creek's separation from its former parent company. The double barrel range was first launched in 2014. Those were wines from the 2012 vintage, and the two wines that launched the brand were a Barossa Valley Shiraz and a Coonawarra Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, as a fruit source, particularly for the Shiraz, they were looking for a rich, powerful wine. So started with premium, warm climate fruit. Therefore, the Barossa Valley would be one of the best places in Australia to be looking for that quality of Shiraz, given the availability of old vine vineyards and the combination of the area's warm climate and its cool evenings. So while originally these were a Barossa Shiraz and a corresponding Coonawarra Cabernet Sauvignon, as the vintages have moved on, this wine has been described as predominantly from the Barossa Valley, and by 2020 I see the fruit source simply being described as Southeastern Australian, although actually the label itself just says wine of Australia. To be fair, that still means that the wine could well contain a large proportion of wine coming from vineyards, say, on the Barossa Valley floor, where you do get flatland trellis vineyards that are laid out to be mechanised. However, being aware that Jacobs Creek has quite a large holding of vineyards in Langhorne Creek, high possibility there's some fruit coming from there, and given the general designation of Southeastern Australia, that could even be including fruit from the Riverlands and from the Murray-Darling region. Obviously, Jacobs Creek aren't producing all their wines from their own vineyards. I believe they work with somewhere in the region of 120 growers. However, they do stress the fact that they have a viticulture team that will go in and work closely with those growers to make sure that the fruit being produced fits the criteria that Jacobs Creek are looking for in every instance. And they try and build these supply arrangements into long-term arrangements. Now, the 2020 vintage was in many ways very challenging. Early on, there was a little frost in October, and high winds also caused problems, but other problems were caused by severe drought and hot spells. There was low soil moisture and below average rainfall for the season. One of the results of this was the setting of a small crop, and that crop then only consisted of really concentrated small berries. As a result, many vineyards were 50% down on their 10-year average of yields. Cooler conditions in January and February, and a little bit of rain in February as well, just helped to save the vintage by slowing ripening and allowing phenolic ripeness to keep pace with sugar accumulation. The result being rich, concentrated wines in 2020. As I've already said, this is likely to be made predominantly from machine-harvested grapes. I don't think the economics of making wine at this price allow much in the way of hand-harvesting, although there may be some hand-harvested portions going into this. Fruit was destemmed and gently crushed into static fermenters, with temperature being controlled throughout fermentation to help regulate the extraction, slow it, and allow the winemakers to control the extraction of colour, flavour and tannins from the fruit. After somewhere between a week and 14 days, the wine was run off into barrel for malolactic conversion and for aging to start. Now, this wine undergoes two sorts of barrel aging, hence the double barrel name. Firstly, it was aged in traditional wine barrels for up to 15 months. By traditional wine barrels, I'm talking about 300 litre hogsheads and a combination of American and French oak. Now, one of the things they do say is that for the richer Shiraz, they use a higher proportion of American oak than for the Cabernet Sauvignon, which tends to get more of the French oak, although they don't define the quantities of either of those. The barrels that they're using are 20% new, with 20% each of second year, third year, fourth year and fifth year barrels. After the initial barrel maturation, the wine is blended and 100% of the wine goes into barrels that had previously held Scotch whisky to be finished for a further 3 months. These are smaller barrels, they're between 200 and 220 litres in size. They're originally made from American white oak and they will have held Scotch whisky for perhaps up to 20 years. Having said that, prior to being used for Scotch whisky, the majority of those barrels will previously have held bourbon when they were new barrels. Now, there are a few differences between these former whisky barrels and a normal wine barrel. They're coarser grained, they have higher toasting, and they have narrower staves, meaning that there are more gaps between the staves and there will be more oxygen ingress into what is a smaller barrel. So there's a greater effect of oxygenation on a smaller volume of wine in one of these barrels. Evidently, each of these barrels is then used for somewhere in the region of 4 years. And the winemakers believe this process of finishing introduces additional intricacy to the flavours and helps to smooth the texture. And as I say, the rich intensity of the Shiraz was considered better suited to aging in Scotch whisky barrels, whereas for the Cabernet Sauvignon that's also in this range, that was better paired with the smoother style that was derived from aging in Irish whisky barrels. I should also point out for any vegan viewers and potential consumers that the notes on the back label say that this has been fined with milk and may contain traces of that. So let's have a taste, shall we? Looking at the wine, it has a good depth of colour. I can just see through it, but it's more than a sort of medium depth. There's quite a vibrant ruby colour. It's holding its colour fairly well to the rim. It's just sort of slightly lighter. There's a slight orangey touch there, but it's not looking particularly developed. The wine is labelled as having 14.5% alcohol and is very readily forming tears on the side of the glass there. It looks like a big viscous wine. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? The nose is rich and ripe. There's a real ripe fruit note to it, almost sort of Christmas cake, Christmas pudding like. There's some sort of high-toned, almost sort of spirity rich flavours coming out of that. Perhaps also there's some notes of baking spice, nutmeg, cinnamon. But yes, there's this underlying rich dark fruit, black plums, prunes, raisins, and actually also a chocolatey smoothness. Perhaps there's some vanilla influence coming from the oak there, adding a sweet richness to the aroma as well. There's a ripeness, there's a little bit of development, perhaps hints of forest floor and earthiness, but they're not particularly obvious as they're sitting behind this sort of powerful, rich, ripe fruit. So it's for taste. That is rich, generous, very smooth. There's quite a fine, grainy texture running through the mid-palate there, quite full-bodied. There's a balanced acidity, but it is interacting with those fine tannins to give a mouth-watering nature to the mid-palate. And that's where you're starting to see some sort of slightly earthy, developed notes, again, maybe slightly forest floor notes. And alongside that, some smoother, more chocolatey notes, and then those resolve back to that more sort of savoury mid-palate. Sitting around the savoury notes, there's some dark, juicy black fruit. It's ripe black cherries, ripe black plums, touches of overripeness, prune and raisin. The wine has a richness and an intensity that's making it last quite well. The warmth of the alcohol is helping to pull up those sort of spicy notes. There are hints of cedar, hints of cinnamon, hints of nutmeg, all sitting in the background, but they're not quite able to push their way through this really rich fruit that really does dominate the back palate. The powerful fruit settles down and becomes that little bit more savoury on the finish, where you end up with some sort of raisin, high ripeness, black fruit notes. The finish lasts reasonably well, although the alcohol is warming. The weight of the fruit is sufficient to stop it dominating the finish and cutting it off short. Personally, if you're looking for a wine that delivers on the idea of being rich, generous, ripe and full-bodied, I think this is a wine well worth looking at. These days, there are trends towards lower alcohol and more elegant styles, but I think sometimes we do just enjoy big, rich, flavoursome wines, and this is certainly it. The notes that Jacob's Creek give suggest that this is a wine that could be aged out to 2027. I think if you're looking for that generosity and opulence, a rounded, rich, ripe fruit, I wouldn't be inclined to keep the wine for much longer than that. Certainly the primary fruit has begun to develop into much more of that tertiary, earthy, forest floor and savoury notes. So I suppose if you like that sort of style, you could keep it that bit longer. But really that has to be a personal decision. I think paired with the right foods, sort of rich meat dishes, a lovely succulent steak comes to mind, this could be a very enjoyable wine. I've seen comments suggesting that really this is a concocted wine, it's a made wine, and I really can't disagree with those too strongly. I guess what those critics are suggesting is really that this is a bit of a gimmick. I think given the fact that maybe other producers haven't followed the idea, may suggest that it hasn't really been a widespread innovation. However, I do think it's quite a good quality wine that delivers on the promises that it makes to be rich, ripe, forward and opulent. There is good depth of fruit, there's a smooth structure, there's ripe fruit and there's some spicy complexity here. Looking at the winesearcher aggregated critics score for this vintage of this wine, it scores 90 out of 100, and I think I agree. I think that's where I would score this wine as well. When I set out to taste it, I really wasn't sure how much I would enjoy this wine. However, I think it has actually won me round. I think it's a competently made style. I can understand that there may well be many consumers looking for elegance in wine who really wouldn't enjoy this wine at all, but I do believe it's done what the winemakers set out to do. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, it would be fantastic if you could press the like button. If you're watching these videos and you enjoy them, do please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. It would really help to build the follower base further, to be able to develop the channel more. If you have any questions or comments, please do pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. Do tell me what you think of Jacob's Creek and the wines in their range. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, I'd be really appreciative if you could forward that to them. That would be a great endorsement coming from you. Now, I will leave a link in the notes below to the winesearcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, and that way you can see where it's available near you and at what price. So hopefully you'll find that a useful link. So thank you so much for taking the time to join me, and I do hope that maybe you'll be able to make some time in the near future and come and join me for another tasting. Hopefully we'll see you then. Bye for now.